Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, we're going to be talking about an aspect of low back pain that often gets overlooked immensely, both in a physical therapy setting and in a general fitness setting, and that is the strength of the back muscles. And by back muscle, I'm not talking about the lats, I'm not talking about the traps or the rhomboids or any of that nonsense. Those are just muscles that exist on the back, but control something else like the shoulder joint or the scapula, right? I'm talking about the muscles that actually move the spine. And I'm talking about, generally speaking, the paraspinal musculature, the spinal erectors, and of course other stabilizers that exist in that area. The general question of this video we're going to try to answer is, should we be protecting the low back or should we be working the low back? And does protect in this sense even mean what we think it means? We'll answer all those things in this video. And I want to start you off with this little clip here of how to protect the low back.
This guide teaches delivery officer how to move, lift and use big water bottles in the right way, because considering the fact that many of these water bottles have to be delivered during the day and whole working week, he had to know the right way in order to avoid back injuries.
Let's suppose for a minute that the item he's lifting weighed 400 pounds. I could totally see finagling your body position all around, using absolute top-tier research-based body mechanics, and taking 10 entire minutes out of your day to put this thing in its appropriate position. Absolutely understandable. The problem is this item doesn't weigh 400 pounds. At most, a water jug, when totally full like this, weighs somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds. It's not that heavy. Now, I could totally see getting that in position being a problem if you're really short and maybe don't have a lot of muscle mass overall. But for the average person, this should not be a difficult task to handle by your low back to get this in position. Now, if you have a rotator cuff tear, maybe get some help. If you've got wrist instability, maybe get some help. But assuming you've got no significant issues, including in your back, this should not be a problem just to pick up and lift upside down and put in position. And this leads me to a really important point that I heard brought up in a YouTube short by none other than Mike O'Hearn. And say what you want about Mike O'Hearn and his duck eggs, and apparently he does not use any kind of steroids or PEDs in his late 50s to get a physique like this, whatever. But there's one thing you can't deny about Mike O'Hearn, and that is this guy has knowledge and he has incredible longevity for being able to lift heavy weights in the gym in his late 50s, which is utterly incredible. Take a look at what he said about low back health here.
What do you do to protect your lower back lifting heavy in your later years?
I train the lower back, and I train the lower back in odd positions, so I know that my lower back is strong. I noticed that a lot of people, they try to protect it, and by protecting it, you're making it weaker. So,
Babying it.
yeah. So one thing I don't do, I don't baby it, and I don't run away from it. And I also know this, the lower back and hips are your number one spot to go first. So make sure you keep that lower back strong.
These techniques that I'm showing right here about how to lift something safely from the ground are not that dissimilar from the clip I showed you 2 minutes ago about how to lift the water jug and put it in position. We have been taught so many ways to protect the low back that we end up in life just almost never using the low back. And what we essentially do is create a weak link in a chain of muscles and make ourselves more susceptible to injury. Now, if you have to lift something that's 300-400 pounds, I would probably recommend using really good mechanics. And if it's heavy enough, maybe you squat down and keep your chest upright. But for many things that we lift during the day, and for a lot of these things, they can be heavier than you realize if you train up to it. You shouldn't have to do that. You should have a very, very strong low back. And that brings me to actually the Merriam-Webster definition of protect. Protect is a verb that means to shield or cover something from injury, damage, or exposure. It can also mean to maintain something's integrity or status. Realistically, by shielding the low back from use against any kind of resistance, what you're essentially doing is just making it weaker, just like Mike O'Hearn implied. And realistically, if we want to protect the low back, we really ought to take the second route here on the definition, and that is to maintain something's integrity or status. And the way that you do that is you don't allow the low back muscles to be a weak link in the chain. You strengthen them. You get them strong so that you can be more resilient against injury. Now, you can never obliterate your risk of injury, and if you do have a hurt low back, you probably shouldn't lift with your low back. You should do other techniques in the meantime while you're healing and strengthening things up. But fear of using the low back, this is one of the most common things that I see in the clinic. We probably all know that one person who, when they were growing up, their parents did everything for them, and now that they're actually an adult and they have to operate in the real world, they can't do anything for themselves on their own, right? They were coddled their whole life. Well, the low back muscles are not that dissimilar from that. If you baby something, it will remain a baby. It's going to remain weak. We need to be strengthening up these muscles. Now, is there an objective way to determine whether your low back muscles are strong or realistically need some work? Well, you can perform what's called the Sorensen hold, and there's two methods by which you can do this. The first, shown here, involves using a Roman chair. Now, I got my feet positioned on the plate of the Roman chair about 45 degrees externally rotated. That's technically putting the external rotation at the hips, although you can use slightly less, maybe 30 degrees. You just want the gluteus maximus to be able to adequately stabilize the hips. And technically, the gluteus maximus and hamstring muscles are active in a Sorensen hold, but generally speaking, they're just keeping the hip angle constant. Your job in this exercise, or test depending on how you're doing it, is to keep your trunk parallel to the floor and to maintain a neutral lumbar spine or one with slight extension. To hold that position, you are utilizing your lumbar extensors, the spinal erectors. Normative times for the Sorensen hold exist out there in the literature, but I would say that on the Roman chair, if you can hold this for 2 uninterrupted minutes with 0 symptoms and no significant loss of that lumbar lordotic curvature, you have high-functioning spinal erectors. You can also perform the Sorensen hold on a GHD machine, and technically this is how the test and exercise are defined. If you don't have a GHD machine, you can certainly use a Roman chair. But on the GHD machine, if you can hold this for 1.5 minutes with no symptoms and no significant loss of the lumbar lordotic curvature, you have high-functioning spinal erectors. Now you might ask, why the difference in times? 2 minutes for the Roman chair, 1.5 minutes for the GHD machine. That is because this test is harder on the GHD machine. Remember that the glutes and hamstrings are having to function to hold the hip position. Well, the glutes are strongest in their lengthened position, and they get a little bit weaker as they approach their shortened position. Well, in the GHD machine setup, the glutes are in their most shortened position. And so they're not going to be as strong there, and so it's going to be a tougher lift. Not from the perspective of the spinal erectors, more from the glutes. On the Roman chair, the glutes are further from their shortened position. They're a little bit more lengthened, maybe by about 30 to 45 degrees, depending on how the apparatus is set up. And so it's going to be a little bit easier on that. So you would need to be able to hold it longer on the Roman chair. Also in this video, we're going to be talking about a systematic approach to getting these spinal erectors stronger. And by spinal erectors, I mean the erector spinae muscles. Laterally, we have iliocostalis. Medial to that is longissimus, and most medial would be the spinalis muscle. And these 3 muscles collectively extend the lumbar spine from a relatively flexed position, like in a Jefferson curl type of motion, but also, as in a good morning, they can contract isometrically to stabilize the spine against excessive lumbar flexion and to limit the amount of lumbar flexion that is occurring in a movement. Very important in a good morning or a deadlift, those type of movements. And you can strengthen them both ways. We'll be talking about that in just a little bit. But this picture seems to suggest that they also produce a little bit of rotation at the lumbar and thoracic spines. Now, their fibers run pretty much mostly vertically, okay? The amount of horizontal trajectory these fibers have is pretty negligible. So while there might be a tiny amount of stabilization against excessive rotation, remember that rotation is a function of the obliques. The oblique muscles are the prime mover of that, no questions, hands down. The amount of rotation these muscles are going to produce is negligible, okay, compared to what the obliques are going to produce. So don't think of it as rotation. These are spinal extension muscles. Now we'll get back to those in just a minute, but I want to also make a note here that we also have some other stabilizer muscles, for example, the multifidus. Now there are many exercises that we can use to target the multifidi. For reference, go check out my video on best practices for gluteus medius strengthening. Any one of those will do to some extent. However, one of my favorites is to do a B stance RDL, particularly with dumbbells. And there's a number of reasons why this is good for hitting the multifidus. Number one, it's a hip hinge movement. Any hip hinge movement, particularly one that's loaded, is going to hit the multifidi and other stabilizer muscles to some extent. But we're also doing this in B stance, so asymmetrically loading the legs. The leg in front, that's the side that we would be targeting the gluteus medius on. But by asymmetrically loading the legs, we're also asymmetrically loading the spine because we're inducing a torque at the spine that has to be counteracted by the stabilization function of these muscles. And so just by virtue that we have that stability need now, more so than in a standard stance, it's going to better hit the multifidus. Additionally, the dumbbells are a little more unstable than a barbell, and so that little extra instability with the dumbbells, that's going to make it a better option than using the barbell for hitting the multifidi. So that exercise and other similar ones, while they still hit the spinal erectors, they're a little better suited for hitting the smaller stabilizer muscles like the multifidi. But for really blasting the spinal erectors, we really need to make sure first that we can activate those without any significant issues. And a great exercise with which you can do that is a dowel hip hinge. So when you're doing this type of hip hinge, you're going to have 2 points of contact always with that stick. And by the way, it does not matter which arm is on top and which is on bottom. It's just based on comfort of the shoulder and so forth. But basically, you want 2 points of contact. One is the area between your shoulder blades, so the upper back, and the bottom one is, for lack of a better phrase, the top of your butt crack. If you do not maintain a neutral spine, meaning a correct isometric contraction of the spinal erector muscles, then normally what happens is one of those points of contact comes off of the stick, and it's usually the bottom one, because it usually becomes more challenging for people toward the bottom of the hinge, and it's going to be the bottom point of contact that dissociates from the stick. But if you are able to maintain those points of contact doing a dowel hip hinge, you can then progress to some loaded exercises where you are maintaining an isometric contraction of the spinal erectors. A great exercise for this is the barbell good morning. The barbell good morning loads the spine directly, and so we get a very, very good workout for those muscles of the back. But you want to make sure to start slow. Just because you can deadlift 400 pounds doesn't mean you can good morning 400 pounds. You have to build up to this. So I recommend starting with the bar, but then of course progressively overloading over time as this becomes easier and easier. Now, when you're executing a good morning, the spinal erectors are contracting isometrically. There should be little to no movement of the back at all. Generally speaking, most scenarios, isometric contractions are inferior to those involving concentric and eccentric, so dynamic movements against resistance through a full range of motion. But when it comes to the back, we want to make sure we first have these isometric movements like a good morning mastered. And don't kid yourself, if you load these up enough, you can build some monster gains in those spinal erectors. But at some point, it is advantageous to build tolerance of the spine and the spinal erectors for moving through a dynamic range of motion. I recommend starting with one involving a smaller range of motion, and here are some exercises that are good for that. Of course, we want to master the lower range of motion exercises, so a smaller dynamic movement, before moving to those involving larger movements. But of course, when you're ready and you have progressively overloaded the resistance and of course the range of motion, you can then begin some of these that involve a larger movement, a larger discrepancy between the lumbar flexion and that end range lumbar extension. But if you, over time, carefully and safely and intelligently overload these with both load and range, you can get immense stability in your low back, immense resilience against injury, to the point where you have to worry a lot less about it when you're doing something as simple as lifting a jug of water. So don't be a glass back. Protect your low back, but do it the right way by working it just as you would any other muscle group. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.